They laughed when he picked up the chalk, then fell silent when it wouldn't leave his hand. Mr. Harold Banks was mopping the back corner of an elite prep school classroom when a snide comment from the math teacher turned the room into a comedy club. "Even our janitor could probably take a crack at this," Mr. Whitmore smirked, motioning toward the massive calculus equation on the board. A few boys chuckled. One even whispered, "Let's see him try." And to everyone's surprise, Harold paused, straightened his back, and calmly asked, "May I?" The room erupted in giggles until he stepped forward. His hand wrapped around the chalk not like a stranger, but like it belonged there. As he began to write, the jokes stopped. The silence grew. What they expected to be a punchline was becoming something else entirely. They thought they'd see a joke. Instead, they saw genius. Where are you watching from? If you've ever been underestimated just because of how you looked, this story is for you. Mr. Harold Banks had become part of the wallpaper at Hawthorne Academy, a prestigious all-boys private school where tradition ran thicker than the uniform stitched into every student's identity. At 68, Harold moved through its halls like clockwork, his blue overalls pressed but faded, mop gliding silently across polished floors that carried generations of privilege. He greeted students with a warm nod, received the occasional polite "sir" from the kind ones, and quiet snickers from others who saw nothing beyond the bucket he pushed. But Harold didn't flinch. He had learned long ago how to let ignorance pass without staining his peace. Decades earlier, he had stood in front of classrooms, not as a janitor, but as a professor of mathematics. He had once written equations on blackboards not to clean them, but to enlighten them. But the world hadn't been ready for a black scholar who solved faster than his white colleagues. One too many closed doors, one too many not the right fit rejections. The chalk was taken from his hand, replaced with a mop, and while the world forgot what he once carried, Harold never did. His mind stayed sharp. Every formula he ever taught still lived behind those steady eyes. Mr. Whitmore, the current math teacher at Hawthorne, couldn't have been more different. Younger, smug, and dressed in arrogance as crisp as his tailored suits, he was the kind of educator who liked the sound of his own lectures more than the silence of a solved equation. He relished being the smartest man in the room, mistaking applause for authority. To him, students weren't minds to shape, they were trophies to show off. The classroom Harold entered that day was tense with academic pressure. Advanced calculus, scrawled across the board, had left the boys whispering and scratching their heads. As Harold swept around the desks, he paused for a moment, eyeing the problem. He tilted his head, not confused, but curious. Then, without a word, he continued, mopping. That pause didn't go unnoticed. Mr. Whitmore caught it and filed it away, waiting for the perfect moment to turn it into a punchline. Because in this school, intelligence belonged to the well-dressed, not the man in overalls. Or so they thought. The classroom was unusually full that day. Parents from the school board had come to observe, and Mr. Whitmore was in full performance mode. He strutted across the front like a stage actor, gesturing toward the chalkboard where a long, complex calculus equation stretched across the surface like a dare. "Gentlemen," he announced to the students and visiting parents, "this is what separates the average student from the exceptional." He waited a beat, theatrically. The boys stared blankly. No hands rose. He clicked his tongue in mock disappointment. "Tough crowd," he murmured, before his eyes landed on Harold Banks quietly emptying the trash near the back of the room. And then, with a smirk curling across his face, Whitmore decided to make it entertaining. "You know," he said, turning to the board with exaggerated flair, "we run such a rigorous curriculum here at Hawthorne that even our janitors could probably take a crack at this." He gestured toward Harold with a flick of the wrist, and the class erupted into scattered laughter. One boy elbowed another. A few chuckled under their breath. But Harold didn't laugh. He stood still, bag half full, his eyes steady but unreadable. "Mister." Whitmore pushed it further, sensing the attention. "Go ahead, Mr. Banks," he said, waving the chalk with mock generosity. "Want to give it a try?" It was meant as a punchline, a light jab to entertain the room. But Harold didn't blink. He placed the trash bag down, slowly wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket, and stepped forward. "May I?" he asked, voice calm, low, but impossible to ignore. Mr. Whitmore froze for half a second, caught off guard by the composure. "By all means," he said, regaining his smirk. The chalk passed from his fingers to Harold's like a crown handed down, but no one expected it to fit. Harold walked too, the board like a man returning to a place he'd never truly left. The boys leaned forward. A few still snickered, but the moment the first line of chalk hit slate, something shifted. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause to think. Each symbol flowed, with clarity, precision, and rhythm. Variables folded into simplifications, derivatives unwound like silk. Step by step, what had seemed like an academic mountain became a path paved in logic. He didn't hold the chalk like a guest. He held it like it never left. One by one, the students' laughter faded into awe. Even the visiting parents who had been casually observing now leaned in, trying to follow the cascade of mathematical grace unfolding before them. Mr. Whitmore's arms slowly folded, this time not in confidence, but in confusion. His face paled as Harold neared the end of the problem, boxed the solution cleanly, and turned to face the room. The silence was louder than any applause, and in that quiet, Harold simply placed the chalk on the ledge and said, "That's how I used to teach it." Then he picked up his rag, nodded politely, and walked back to the trash can, leaving the room and everyone in it, reeling in the shadow of genius they never saw coming. Harold didn't rush. Each stroke of chalk was deliberate, elegant, like calligraphy written in logic. He didn't just solve the problem, he unraveled it, revealing its rhythm and heartbeat. The equation wasn't just numbers and symbols to him. It was a language he hadn't spoken aloud in years, but never forgot. Line by line, he worked with fluid mastery, reducing each expression with the precision of a man who'd taught not for applause, but for understanding. The classroom that had just minutes before been filled with laughter now sat in a kind of reverent stillness. Not one chair squeaked, not one student whispered. Their eyes were locked on a janitor who had just become the smartest man in the building. Mr. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably near the board, the forced smirk draining from his face. "Actually, I think there's a misstep here," he offered, quickly, pointing to a bracket Harold had just opened. Harold paused, looked at him calmly, and without a trace of disrespect, adjusted a single term with a quiet, "You're right, it should be factored before isolating the variable." He then continued, seamlessly, the correction only further confirming he wasn't guessing. He knew, and now everyone else did too. As Harold neared the final line of the problem, the tension in the room gave way to awe. Even the students who hadn't understood the question were now watching like they were seeing a performance, not a lesson, and, in a way, they were. A man who'd been invisible in their halls for years was rewriting how they understood intelligence, how they understood humility, and how they understood power. Harold placed the chalk down gently, almost reverently, and stepped back from the board. Then, turning to the room, his voice steady and low, he said, "This is how I used to teach. Before I was told my kind didn't belong in front of classrooms." The words didn't come from a place of bitterness, but from quiet memory. And in that moment, every person in that room understood that this wasn't just about calculus. It was about what had been stolen from him, and what he had refused to let be taken entirely. They gave him a broom, but he never let go of the chalk. A slow creak broke the silence as the classroom door swung further open. Standing there, arms folded and eyes serious, was Headmaster Collins. He had arrived sometime during the demonstration, unnoticed, and watched it all unfold from the threshold. The room shifted toward him instinctively. Mr. Whitmore stiffened, suddenly very aware of how small he seemed. Collins didn't raise his voice. He simply cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Mr. Banks," he said, pausing with a gravity that held the room, "would you consider returning to teaching?" Harold looked at him for a moment, surprised, but not shaken. His face held the trace of a smile, not prideful, just honest. And for the first time in a long time, he saw not pity in their eyes, but respect. The kind that should have come decades ago, the kind that had always belonged to him. Later that day, the classroom buzzed not with gossip, but reverence. After Harold's quiet departure, one curious student, James Archer, pulled out his phone and typed "Harold Banks Math" into a search bar. What came up didn't match anything they had expected. "Wait, guys," he muttered, eyes wide, scrolling faster. "He's in journals, like real journals, academic ones." The others leaned in. On screen were article after article authored by Dr. Harold T. Banks, Ph.D. in Applied Mathematics from the University of Chicago. One paper, published in 1978, had been cited hundreds of times. It dealt with dynamic systems theory, advanced, brilliant, and way ahead of its time. The room fell silent again, but not because of embarrassment, because of awe. That single search unraveled a hidden legacy. Harold had once been a rising star in academia, his work applauded by mathematicians across the globe. But the 1970s weren't kind to a black man with a mind sharper than his tenured colleagues. When it came time to offer him a permanent position, doors that had once opened with smiles slammed shut. He was too young, too radical, not a good fit. And quietly, he was blacklisted. His research used, his name faded. The world had tried to erase him, but the numbers didn't lie. They never had. The past tried to erase him, but numbers don't lie. Within hours, the video of Harold solving the equation, recorded on a parent's phone and uploaded by a student, began spreading across social media. The caption read, "Our janitor just humbled our entire school with calculus. Turns out he's Dr. Harold Banks." It didn't take long for mathematicians, alumni, and educators across the country to notice. Hashtags like "Cute, Dr. Banks was here," and "A chalk over broom" began to trend. By the end of the week, Mr. Whitmore had been quietly removed from the department's leadership team. No formal announcement was made, but his name disappeared from several event committees and mentorship roles. His arrogance had crumbled beneath the weight of a truth he'd failed to see right in front of him. And then came the letter. An email arrived at the school addressed to Harold from Dr. Franklin Meyer, once a tenured rival at the university where Harold had been pushed out. It was public, deliberate, and humbling. "Harold," it read, "I failed you then. I see now that your brilliance wasn't only unmatched, it threatened a system built to keep you silent. I hope this letter, though, long overdue, reaches you with the respect I never gave you when it mattered most. The world is finally catching up to what you always were, and in that the student saw the full shape of the lesson, that genius isn't always celebrated in its time, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always rise." A month after the classroom incident, the air around Hawthorne Academy had changed, not through announcements or assemblies, but through something quieter and deeper. Students had begun stopping Harold in the halls, not to hand him trash or rush past him, but to ask him questions, real questions, about math, about life, about how someone could carry so much knowledge so silently. And Harold, as he always had, answered with patience. The headmaster followed through on his offer. Harold returned, not full-time and not with fanfare, but as a part-time mentor and instructor. 3 afternoons a week he taught advanced problem-solving. Workshops, open to all students but especially focused on those who didn't feel like they belonged in the front row. Students who were often quiet. Students who didn't come from legacy families or polished privilege. He spoke to them not just with equations, but with the kind of stories they didn't hear in textbooks. Stories about being doubted, overlooked, and still pushing forward. "It's not the degree that makes you ready," he once told a nervous student. "It's what you do when people think you aren't." He didn't reclaim a title. He reclaimed a truth. Mr. Whitmore, after weeks of scrutiny and a formal disciplinary review, quietly left the school. The administration issued no dramatic press release, only a staff-wide email thanking him for his service. But everyone knew why he was gone. The students didn't miss him. They had found a better teacher in the man who once emptied their trash. Harold continued mopping in the early mornings, by choice. He still believed in order, in humility, in quiet work. But now, that mop didn't define him. It was simply part of who he was. And that duality of genius and grace was what made him unforgettable. One morning, the headmaster approached him with news. He'd been nominated for the state's Excellence in Education Award. "You're not just a teacher, Mr. Banks," he said. "You're a story this school needed to hear." Harold smiled softly. "I appreciate that," he replied, "but I still like to start my days with clean hallways." To honor his legacy, the school established the Dr. Harold T. Banks Math Scholarship, aimed at supporting low-income students from underrepresented backgrounds who showed exceptional promise in mathematics. The first recipient, a shy sophomore, named Malik, cried when he learned he wouldn't have to drop out due to tuition costs. "You saved my dream," he told Harold one afternoon after class. Harold placed a hand on his shoulder and simply said, "It's your dream. I just made sure no one swept it away." He was never just the janitor. They were just never ready to see the professor in him. Harold Banks walked the same halls he had for years, but now heads turned not in dismissal, but in deep respect. The chalk and the mop coexisted in his hands, just as brilliance and humility did in his heart. He had nothing to prove. He simply waited for the moment the world could finally see what he'd quietly carried all along. Have you ever been looked down on until you revealed what they never imagined? Have you ever watched someone underestimate you, only to witness their silence when truth took the floor? Share this if you believe brilliance doesn't need a title. It needs a chance. Drop your city in the comments and follow for more stories where genius wears blue collars. Thanks for watching. Until next time, never judge by what's in their hands. Look for what's behind their silence.